Hi there. In this video, we will go over AWS IP addressing in a virtual private cloud. The first topic we will cover will be private IP addresses, followed by public IP addresses, and then elastic IP addresses. So, the AWS definition for a private IPv4 address is an IP address that is not reachable over the internet. In this example over here, you can see that there is a virtual private cloud with a CIDR notation of 10.5.0.0/16. This gives a total range of 65,536 hosts that could reside within this virtual private cloud. The virtual private cloud over here is subdivided into two parts between availability zone 1 and availability zone 2. Within each AZ, we have two subnets, and the first subnet, the IP range starts from 10.5.0.0/24, which allows a total of 256 hosts to be residing within this virtual network within the subnet. Similarly, subnet 2 is part of the larger VPC CIDR range, and the range of this subnet 2 is 10.5.1.0/24, which again gives a total hosts of 256 within this subnetwork. Now, when you launch an instance, then unless specified by you, AWS allocates a default primary private IPv4 address for the instance. Now, in this example over here, as you can see, subnet 1 is not connected to the internet gateway. It is only doing local addressing of IPv4 hosts. So when you launch an instance, in this case, if you have not already specified what is going to be the IPv4 address for this particular instance, then AWS will allocate a primary private IPv4 address for this instance over here. So over here you can see for this particular instance, the IPv4 address is 10.5.0.233. For those who are not clear about what IPv4 address means, IPv4 address is like specifying the home address of the EC2 instance so that network traffic can be routed to the correct instance. The instance receives a primary private IP address from the IPv4 address range of the subnet. If you see over here, this subnet has a CIDR block notation of 10.5.0.0/24, which gives 256 hosts, and one of the IPv4 hosts from this 256 hosts is allocated to this particular instance as a private IPv4 address. Each instance has a default network interface (ETH-0) that is assigned the primary private IPv4 address. Amazon Web Services also gives an internal DNS hostname that is mapped to the default primary private IPv4 address. As you can see over here, so the moment this EC2 instance was given a IPv4 address, automatically a DNS hostname is created for this EC2 instance. For those who are not clear what a DNS hostname is, a hostname is like specifying the street name of a EC2 instance instead of specifying the address, which is in this case the IPv4 numerical address. The default primary IP address is associated with the network interface for its lifetime, even when the instance is stopped and restarted, and it is released only when the instance is terminated. So what this means is, if this EC2 instance is stopped, in that case the IPv4 address will persist. You will still see that when you restart this EC2 instance, you will again see the same IPv4 address and the same DNS hostname. Unless and until you terminate this EC2 instance, only then this IPv4 address is released back into the pool of this subnet over here. You can add additional multiple private IP addresses to an EC2 instances, which can be reassigned from one instance to another without waiting for the instance to be terminated. In the case of public IP addresses, we first go over the AWS definition of what a public IP address is. So a public IP address is an IPv4 address that is simply reachable from the internet. As you can see in this particular example, we have subnet 2 over here, which has the CIDR block notation of 10.5.1.0/24, which gives a subnetwork of 256 hosts inside this particular virtual network. So what happens is, since this instance is attached to the internet gateway, so the IPv4 address automatically is reachable from the internet. So when you launch an instance in a default virtual private cloud, AWS assigns it a public IP address by default. In this case, 10.5.1.10. By default, AWS does not assign a public IP address to instances launched in a non-default subnet. When you launch an instance into a non-default virtual private cloud, the subnet has an attribute that determines whether the instances launched into that subnet should receive a public IP address from the public IPv4 address pool. Once again, as you can see over here, this IPv4 address comes from this pool, and this pool is from this CIDR notation from subnet 2. A public IP address is assigned to your instance from Amazon's pool of public IPv4 addresses, but not associated with your AWS account. This means that when a public IP address is disassociated from your instance, it is released back into the public IPv4 address pool and you cannot reuse it. So this is different from a private IP address. In a private IP address, if you were to simply stop your EC2 instance, your private IPv4 address persists over here. But in the case of a public IP address, once you stop your EC2 instance and then restart it, then the IPv4 address, the public IPv4 address and the public DNS hostname will change. Your stopped or hibernated instance receives a new public IP address when it is started. For example, it could change from 10.5.1.10 to 10.5.1.67, and a new DNS hostname would also be provided. In the case of elastic IP addresses, the AWS definition is an elastic IP address is a static IPv4 address that is designed for dynamic cloud computing. Now, an elastic IP address is actually a public IPv4 address which is reachable from the internet. Elastic IP addresses are static, persistent public IP addresses which can be associated and disassociated with the instance as required. This means even after stopping or termination of the instance, the elastic IP address remains same. So as you can see over here, what has changed over here now is that instead of a public IPv4 address, we now have an elastic IPv4 address. So the elastic IPv4 address will remain static even if you were to stop or even terminate the instance. By using elastic IP address, you can mask the failure of an instance or software by rapidly remapping the address to another instance in your account. So this is the benefit of having an elastic IPv4 address. In case this EC2 instance were to fail, in that case, you would not need to then have a remap your entire code to a new public IPv4 address because the elastic IPv4 address remains the same. So if this instance were to fail or if you were to terminate it, this elastic IPv4 address would automatically be remapped to this second instance over here to ensure that your software and your virtual private cloud remains available. So once again, by using elastic IP address, you can mask the failure of an instance or software by rapidly remapping the address to another instance in your account. So this covers IPv4 addressing within a virtual private cloud. I hope you found this useful. Please do hit like or subscribe and do keep watching our videos. Thank you.